Great. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to FEMYSO discusses Black Lives Matter. This is a session which aims to highlight the anti-Black racism that is endemic across Europe and how as Muslims, we have a responsibility to provide solidarity to Black communities globally in their struggle to overcome the specific oppression that they face. FEMYSO is the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. We've been proud to be the voice of Muslim youth in Europe for the last 24 years. And we felt that it was a duty upon us to discuss this issue, to discuss its effect on people in Europe and to discuss its effect on all of our lives in general. It's a responsibility, as we believe as Muslims, to be at the forefront of justice. Therefore, we felt that this discussion could and must be prioritized above everything else. I am very lucky to have three incredible speakers with me today, and I thank them, of course, for their attendance. We have Celine Fabrequette, host of Ma Vie Citoyenne Europe, a EU web TV show for and by people of color. She currently is also working at Ecolis, a community initiative that works towards challenging the effects of climate change. I also have Olatunji, the Vice President Student Affairs of the Federation of Student Islamic Societies in the United Kingdom, and who is of course a member organization of FEMYSO, and Abiola Muhammed, a PhD candidate currently completing a doctorate in counseling psychology, and someone who has spoken on the topic in Ireland and past that. Thank you, all of you, for joining us and for this discussion. I hope we're able to achieve and actually discuss a lot of things over the next hour or so. I'd also like to welcome our audiences. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box that is provided to you on YouTube as you're all watching. Our lovely panelists are more than willing to answer your questions, and I'm sure would provide you with great answers. Okay, we will begin now. And where I wanted to start the discussion was discussing racism and anti-Blackness in the lives of the panelists, in the context that they find themselves in, and the countries that they find themselves in. I will start with Ayo. Ayo, how is the United Kingdom's response, or how is the United Kingdom's, what is the reality of being a young Black man in the UK?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's a very important question, pertinent question at this time. I've seen a lot of things going on social media. I think obviously part of the reason I think this discussion is because of it's a very important discussion to have just about racism towards Black communities. And I think just looking at what happened with George Floyd, it is connected to so many wider events across America, across the UK, across Europe, across the world, in terms of the plight of Black people. And I think what happened, what we sort of saw on social media, and the videos we witnessed, it really connected with Black communities across the world. And it really, I think there was a sort of collective pain that was sort of felt. And I think through that pain, people were pushed and sort of jumped into starting something, started conversations that started, again, these conversations have been happening, these movements have been going on, but I think really, there was a massive push to bring these things to the fore because people are quite tired. We're looking at the UK context, for example. In London, a Black man is 7 times more likely, or 4 times more likely, actually, sorry, to be stopped in search. And in the rest of England, it's 7 more times likely on average. If you go to areas like, Dorset or Cornwall sort of areas, southwest of England, you will find that it can go up to 17 times as likely to be stopped in search, compared with, Black people compared with their white counterparts. And it doesn't matter whether you work in a well-paying job, whether you dress nicely. As long as you're a Black person, you'll find in the UK, you will find some kind of prejudice. A lot of people also make this comparison that the racism in the UK is not as bad as the US, usually because referring to the fact that the police in the UK do not have guns, and whereas the police in the US do have guns. And I think I have sort of multiple points to that. I think the first thing is that we do have a long list of individuals who have been killed by police in police custody and by police hands in the UK. Some names that I've mentioned quite a few times: Christopher Adler, Sean Rigg, Rashawn Charles, Adrian McDonald. There are so many names. These are just but a few names, and I really encourage people to go and search those up. And I keep saying, if you were to tell the families and relatives of those individuals that the racism in the UK is not as bad as the US, I don't think that'll be a conversation that will go well. We can't quantify the suffering looking at does this police force have guns? Police forces have different ways of harassing communities, and stop and search is one of the biggest ones. Sectioning is also something that Black communities disproportionately face. As a Black person, if you go to your general practitioner, so your local doctor, and you're suffering from mental health issues and you want to get help with that, you're 50% more likely to be sectioned. So a section is essentially the police will forcibly take you into custody and put you in a psychiatric unit because you're sort of a threat to yourself and you think you're more prone to violence. You're 50% more likely as a Black person than your white counterpart to be sectioned forcefully by police. And again, it's sort of, characterization of Black people being violent, whether it be to others or onto themselves. And I think, again, this comparison of whether it's not as bad in the UK as it is in the US, it's very important that we understand most of the racism we see in the world, or at least a huge majority of it, a huge portion of it, actually came from the UK in terms of, racism is not something that was started in the lower classes of the working classes. It was something, the way I like to refer to it is social influences of that time, of hundreds of years ago. These are people who were philosophers, scientists, academics, thinkers. They classified people into races, with Black people at the bottom, white people at the top, and in the middle, going from the top to the bottom, it'd be, how light-skinned you are, and then by the time you get to the bottom, it's about how dark-skinned you are. And they attributed, intelligence. So if you're at the bottom, so Black people, they don't have any intelligence. They're animalistic, they're barbaric. And this was a rhetoric that was pushed through legislation. It's still pushed through legislation now, subtly. It was pushed through societal discourse. It's been pushed through institutions, and it's been very much a top-down approach in terms of pushing out that narrative. So people need to understand. I sort of compare Britain to the eye. It's like the eye of the storm. When we look at other countries, there seems to be so much turmoil going on, and people look at Britain and say there's not much happening here. When you're in the eye of the storm, things may seem quite calm, but that's not the case, because this is the place that birthed, in many senses, that sort of racism. Of course, racism has sprouted from different places, but I think the UK really did a lot to institutionalize that and export it around the world through the British Empire. I think a last point to mention is, obviously, people would have seen some people. I've seen names describing this group as the anti-fascist or the right-wing protesters, and different names have been used to describe I think we should call them racist, because they've been chanting on the streets of London yesterday that things like "we're racist and we love it," things like that. They're being very proud about it. They said they came out and defend war memorials and to defend the statue of Winston Churchill, and they disagree with police violence. Yet, we saw them doing Nazi salutes. We saw them fighting against police. And again, this thing of the UK's racism isn't bad. I think we've now seen the violent and very outward, explicit personification of that racism, through the riots that have gone on with these racists on the streets of London. And they harassed people, they attacked people unprovoked. And so we should really name them what they are. A lot of, maybe political parties or political leaders have maybe shied away from calling them racist, but that's what they are. I think it's really important we also realize, last thing, that the elite, again, there's still this link between the elite and the working class and the lower classes. The elite have created, they've created this violent racism we're seeing on the streets. They may distance themselves from it at times, like we saw yesterday. They may not comment or they may denounce them, but once we leave social media, these politicians, these organizations, these groups, the media as well, education systems, they are the ones molding people's minds, with fake news, with distortions of news, with giving a sort of revisionist account of history that discounts the British Empire and its crimes. You know, they have created these minds, they've created this violent racism that's on the ground, but they will distance themselves from it in public, or they may not say anything. But we must remember that that is actually the root of where it comes from, and it's very important to consider that in this conversation. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm sure we'll expand later on, inshallah.
Well, thank you so much, Ayu, for that. You know, I completely agree with you as a young black guy that grew up in inner city London. I think stop and search became the norm, to the extent that officers, when they'd stop me, I said, "I'll fill out the form myself. Don't waste my time. I know what to do." Right? I think that's an experience from many young black youth. And I think the historical nature that you mentioned is also super important, because I just last week, it was interesting that my school, as part of like a lot of the discussion that's being had right now, because you had a slave owner's statue that was thrown into a river in Bristol. My school was actually founded by a man called, or named after a man called Sir John Cass, who was a director of the Royal African Company. And that was a really interesting moment for many of us that went to the school, because of course we weren't aware of this link. And I think exactly like you've said, like the historical nature of the empire and what the empire has meant, and how, and of course its negative effects on black people and those in the global south, in inverted commas. No, thank you. I'll now move on to Abiola. Abiola, it'd be great to hear your perspective, or how discussing your thoughts on how racism and anti-blackness manifests in Ireland. To yourself, of course, as a visible black Muslim woman. And also it'd be great to hear your thoughts, especially as someone who is of course in academia and someone who's in the pursuit of a PhD. How does it manifest in those instances as well?
I think kind of like what Aya was saying, it kind of touches a bit in that, like, say in Irish history, they have this shared experience of, you know, say, you know, the plantations that happen in Ireland. And I think from that Irish perspective, they always held the view that they're not racist and racism doesn't really exist in Ireland. Whereas the reality is it does exist, but it comes out in a different version. So like, I think for me personally, what I found very helpful was like actually doing my research on like race and cross-racial therapy. And the more I went into it, I realized that like the way racism presents itself in the Irish context is through microaggressions. So like, where at times it's either a comment or a look or something that it's very hard for you to capture. It's very hard for you to actually be like, that person was racist, or it's very hard for you to challenge. And there's extensive research that has been done on this particular nature, of racism. But in Ireland, I found personally that like my worst experience when it comes to individual racism comes from that aspect, where I say someone will say a comment or maybe ignore you or pass by you or just do something that like, you know, that like your race is playing a role in the situation, but it's very hard for you to call them up or for you to address it. So then what the research actually ended up showing to me was how there is so much research that states about like the internal process that goes on with that, where, you know, you start doubting yourself, you're left with like this really like a part of you where it feels really hurt, frustrated, but with nothing to do with it. So it becomes like this charge buildup of emotion, but nowhere for you to express it. And like, I think whenever I started like doing that research and I started realizing that like this is something that wasn't just in my own head, I got to a stage that I was able to start saying to people that like, you know, like actually microaggression does have an impact on your mental health. You know, whether or not we choose to address it, because everybody has like, you know, their own different attitude towards it. So like for some people they joke about it, for some people they call it up right there, some people just completely dismiss it and make it go over their head. But the research suggests that like actually regardless of whatever stance you take towards it, it does have an impact on your mental health. And whenever I started realizing that, I was like, oh, actually, why isn't this a thing that we talk about? Why isn't this something that like, I know like within certain circles, it's well known that like microaggression has such a massive impact on your mental health. But in other circles, it's just this natural thing that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Another thing that Aya was saying that like I actually found really interesting is around the historical aspect. So like a lot of times whenever I've talked to people about racism in Ireland and just their stance in general in Ireland is like the Irish just can't be racist because they've had their experience of the Irish taking over parts of the English taking over parts of the Irish country whenever they didn't want to. But whenever I went and did my own personal research, actually like Ireland actually moved through the and involved and actually benefited from colonization so much the whole area in that Cork where that particular area like actually flourished was because of colonization.
Abiola.
Whereas whenever we went through school, hello?
Hi there. Just we lost you for about maybe 10 seconds.
Oh, okay.
You can go back.
What point was I on?
You were discussing just after when you began discussing how the Irish don't believe that they can be racist because of that and how the historical nature.
Yeah, so like the Irish have like a historical link towards colonization in that like they really benefited from it. So like there's a specific area in Ireland, Cork, where like they really benefited from like colonizations and like they were like I think 1 in 8 of like all the slave traders were Irish. So like just to show how prevalent, because Ireland is actually has a very small population. So if 1 in 8 of them were slave traders, then that goes to show how many of them were involved in slavery and were trading slaves. Whereas like because of their overall history of them also experiencing British in the same way, they kind of like whenever we went through school and through the education system, that aspect, that historical aspect is completely hidden and not talked about or discussed at all. Whereas like we spent ages talking about like how plantation, how much impacted the Irish and how they struggled for their freedom, and all that area is really discussed, whereas like the part that really impacted say people from minority backgrounds is completely hidden. So because of that, because of the stance that they hold around racism not being a thing that is prevalent in Ireland, there's no policy or like guidelines that protect against racism in Ireland. So, you know, there's countless of stories that I can pull out from like say working in the youth clubs where like young people will end up at the police station from like being discriminated, from people spitting, shouting at them, whatever, and the guard to be like, well, there's nothing we can do for you, and it moves nowhere. So like in terms of racism in Ireland, one of the most impactful thing about it is the fact that like it's initially denied or like completely buried. So like all you experience and your feelings around it is not even validated.
Wow. No. Thank you so much for that. There's so much to unpack there. I think from your initial element about microaggressions, and I think each and every one of us, of course, on this call has experienced those, from telling us how we speak English very well, even though, or French, of course, in the case of Celine, that we speak very well for people from our backgrounds, or asking us where we're from constantly, and some of us that may have hair like mine, someone deciding to touch it without any permission, which is always a fun way to start a conversation. And also, I think it's really interesting you discussed the point about how people who are subjected to racism unable to see racism they may be doing themselves. I think that's a really, really interesting point, and one that I'd love to maybe come back to later on in the conversation as well. Well, thank you, Abiola. I'll pass it on to Celine. Please do provide us with your perspective on racism, its manifestation that you've seen, of course, in your own life, being someone who was in France and of course now in Belgium, 2 countries with huge historical relationships with anti-blackness and the exporting of anti-blackness.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Yusuf. Thank you, FEMYSO, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm just going to stress the point that Ayo said about George Floyd. I think it's important to acknowledge that his horrifying death has kind of awakened us all. There's been, all the organizations that are fighting every day on anti-racism, Black Lives Matters. I mean, they were already there, they were already fighting, but it seems like it had awakened a lot of us, whether it's other Black people, whether it's white people, whether it's, you know, Muslim community, other people of color. I feel like it has all awakened us that we were kind of sleeping, that we were ourselves denying, or at least coasting, you know, we were like just having, you know, coasting away. And this horrific event kind of woke all of us up and give us maybe another breath, I guess, to be out there. Because it's one thing to have hundreds and thousands of people from one country to be out there, but it's another thing to have it happening all over the world on a multiple scale, and for the past 3 weeks. It is totally different. It's stating something, it's saying something. And the fact that a lot of politicians or media are kind of diminishing that is horrifying to me. Because just the word racism, as you said, I'm from France. I'm originally from Cameroon and I'm living in Belgium. So for both of the country I've lived with and the country I'm living in, the word racism it's like a banned word. It's like it's not even like it doesn't exist. It's like they are denying their own history because they feel bad about it, but they are okay to talk about World War I, World War II at length. I mean, you learn about it so much. Like, you know better than about slavery and colonization. We barely know anything in terms of what happened. And I think this is something that each of the countries, or all country within the European Union and all country in Europe, should really learn about. Because I feel like as long as they deny it, they cannot understand when we speak and talk to them about structural racism, institutional racism. They can't understand that, because when we talk about that, which is what a lot of people on the street are talking about when it comes to the police, they tell us, no, but it, like, not all of the police. But we're not talking about individual people. We're talking about the institution. We're talking about, we agree that not all policemen are racist, but we are saying that within the institution, when there are racist people within that institution, they are overusing the power that has been provided to them, and that the system inside is protecting them. That is called institutional racism. And the other thing that people doesn't understand is that it doesn't stop with the police. You know, Abiola and Ayo said it. It's also in education, it's in access to employment, it's into access to housing. All of those things all together does have to point out, you know, that there is definitely institutional racism. So, and at EU level, I mean, I do want to say a couple of things that's been happening at the European level since this has been happening. So the EU Commissioner, Dali, has issued a statement, you know, supporting the situation, denouncing the racism, and saying they are going to do a lot of things about it, but we're still waiting. But the fact, like, she is saying something, this is, like, it may sound like a small step, but it is a big step, because she is a commissioner at EU level, and literally 4 years ago, this would never happen before. there is also Joseph Borrell, who is the EU High Representative on External Action for EU, who in a press conference literally said, Black Lives Matters. I mean, this is huge. He was the first one to just come out, and recognize what was doing. But the good thing is that those two commissioners, they recognize that, yes, what's happening in the US is awful, but let's not be stupid and think like this is not happening also in Europe. And I think that is really important. Ayo also mentioned the fact that people are just saying like, yeah, but why are you comparing, what's happening in the US? Because the police are different. They don't, like in the UK, they don't bear arms, etc. But like, as a French person in France, police bear arms, and they are still saying like it's not the same, because in France the police is, it's a federal, like it's the government who is like running it, as in the US is more like by okay, Minnesota is a state. Yeah, it's state police instead of federal police. And then in France it's federal police it's not like we don't have state police. So they feel like, well, because they all get the same training, then it can't be institutionalized. So that's their argument basically, which is pretty lame, but what can we say? And there's also 118 MEP that wrote a letter to the EU president to ask her to actually make a specific statement, which she hasn't done it yet, which is very awful, I will say. But the European Parliament, they also did a discussion on it on the European Human Rights Committee. And next Wednesday, they are going to have this discussion on the plenary. So it is moving, but we should definitely not stop. Like it's not like because there's some small step taking that we should take a stop. So for me and for years, I've always seen like it's for countries like France and Belgium, and maybe it's for other countries, slavery and colonization is like a trauma. It's a trauma that the state or the people are just, they're not willing to face their history in the face and saying, well, this is happening, and teaching it. Like I feel like it's called, like we call it like white fragility. So there's definitely a lot of white fragility happening, lately. And it's tough. Like, I'm not gonna lie, it's really tough in terms of like emotionally. It's a lot. It's a lot for a community to having always to defend ourselves, to having to prove and explain the reason why we're feeling this way, So I'm just gonna stop there. But yeah, it's kind of, this is what I would say in terms of like what's the situation at the EU level in terms of policy making, and also what I will say in terms of how certain government are reacting to anti-racism.
No, completely no. Thank you so much for that. Of course, the death of George Floyd, as Aya mentioned, is not an isolated incident within America, nor within the countries that we all live in ourselves. In many cases in Britain, of course, in France, Adama Traoré, a case that since 2016 has been ongoing, and the lack of willingness for the institutions and the states to accept that mistakes can be made by the security apparatus is one that I think we have all struggled with, and we will of course continue to fight for. I think another question that came to mind was the difficulties or the manifestations in different institutions themselves, like Celine mentioned a little bit, within the education sector. racism, colonization, amongst other things, isn't taught, and the reason that isn't taught often is said that it isn't inclusive. Ayo, do you want to speak towards that? Like, how can our education systems be more inclusive of issues like that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I just want to go quickly back to the history aspect of things, just so I can feed in with some stats. I really believe that, you know, the past is now, in that things that happened in the past have direct ramifications as to what is going on now. Although some people may say it's in the past, leave it there, you know, we can't do that. We have to examine it and understand how we arrived here. When you look at the sort of, there were many thinkers that theorized this sort of gradation of races. It tended to be, or it always was actually, white people at the top. Then next, usually, and some of these guys, you know, Immanuel Kant is actually a notable one within that group, even though people just see him as a blameless philosopher, whereas he very much fed into these kind of discussions and racist conversations. So you'd have white, Chinese, then you'd have, they sometimes characterized all Asians as Hindus, a very sort of blind way of looking at things, ignorant way of looking at things. But generally Asians, depending on skin color, and then black people at the bottom. And I think what is very interesting is when you look at the current, you know, when you look at the current education system and the sort of gaps of attainment, it literally follows that exact same hierarchy. One can say it's coincidence. One, you know, we can you know, say whatever we like, but I think there is something to be said there, and I think that is quite significant. So, you know, Chinese people, the last time I checked the stats from a couple of years ago, Chinese students have about a 6% gap, and this is sort of home students in terms of the ethnic minorities. I'm speaking on home students. So Chinese home students are, you know, do 6% worse than their white counterparts. I think Indian students do around 11% or so worse than their white counterparts. And then when you look at Pakistani and Bengali students, Bangladeshi students, they tend to do around 17 to 20% worse than their white counterparts. When you actually look at who's at the bottom, black, specifically black Caribbean, actually, you see that there's a 26, 27, 28% gap, depending on ethnicity, within the black sort of racial subgroup. So it actually follows that line of doing things, and I think that for me just emphasizes the fact that, you know, there is an effect from these disgusting and racist anti-black views that are pushed out from, you know, it could be from a couple hundred years ago, that will still find its way to trickle down till now. So the sun's in my camera. Next point I was going to make is that, you know, when you look at the history discussions around history in schools, is very revisionist, and there's a selective amnesia about, you know, Britain's past and Britain's history. We sort of look at, you know, we do a bit of the Tudors, Henry VIII, we do a bit of Battle of the Hastings, and then we sort of fast forward. I think some schools may touch on, sorry, the light is actually just finding a way. Okay, that's better. Some schools may touch on the civil rights era very briefly, sort of just to touch on it. Most of them will mention Martin Luther King and leave out Malcolm X, or sort of portray Martin Luther King as the good advocate for you know, civil rights, and Malcolm X as the bad one. And I think, you know, this, and sometimes, you know, my brother, for example, he's in secondary school. He's studying slavery, and he's just all that he's learned in school about black people is that they were enslaved. Nothing about the kingdoms, nothing about the history. You know, if you go back to 12th century West Africa, they actually had a form of cataract surgery, although the method for it was lost. And this was developed, you know, much before anything was developed in the Western world, or by the time it got to that point in the Western world and in the UK. You know, they also had indoor sewage systems. Would you believe it? Again, these are not things that people are educated about and is put to the forefront. You know, there's the constant message from education is that, you know, black people are less than, and they haven't really contributed anything significant to the world at large. And I think, you know, it's that revisionist that actually, and also another thing is the British Empire. schools are the number one place for social conditioning. From the ages of when you're very young up until age 18. These are your most formative years, right? These are when views are sort of put into you and injected into you, and your mind is molded. When we look at the teaching of British colonialism, there's literally nothing. I myself did not even understand the ins and outs of British colonialism until I was a sort of second year university student, going on 21 years of age, 20 years of age. And there are some who literally go their whole lives without knowing that the fact that, it was actually Britain in the Boer War in the south of Africa. They started concentration camps. People don't know about that. There was also, the killing of Kenyans in the Mau Mau revolt. There are so many instances all over the world, not just in the African continent. But when you take that aside and you dress up the figures that, institutionalized this, gave the orders to kill people, for example, Churchill is a very good example. When you take that aside and you don't add that into the history books, you don't add that into the teaching, you create this sort of false image of uncritical image. Actually, it's very uncritical. Of these figures that are venerated in British society, which is why you see people defending Churchill to the death, because we are presenting this new narrative to them. It's new to them that, oh, he was actually very racist and he starved millions of people in a famine in Bengal, right? They've never heard this. They're hearing it, 20, 30, 40 years after they've left school, to the point where, the image that was the revisionist image that was created for them is so deeply embedded in their minds, in their sort of consciousness, that they can't even, and their sort of identities are based on that as well. Again, school is where you sort of find yourself, find your identity. The identity is based on that image. Now you try and come to them with another rhetoric, they cannot handle it. So the education system, which is what I was saying before, the education system is very, very responsible, because once you form people like that, we really need to get more resources, a holistic study of the civil rights movement in the US, speaking about Malcolm X, and again, not dressing him up as this sort of terrible person and boogeyman. I think an actual reflective and genuine insight into him. Also, there was things going on in the an insight into the civil rights movement in the UK and how that's progressed and the movements here. I think a proper understanding of African history, Black African history, I think would really, really help to disperse this idea that African people are barbaric. All they were was enslaved, they're weak, all this sort of stuff. If we have a proper education system that's reflective of history and reflective of what has happened, I feel like the minds that we, that come out of schools, they're going to value human life. They're going to value Black life over blind nationalism and patriotism. And the last thing as well, universities have a very big responsibility to do more than releasing statements, to do more than sort of giving empty sort of solidarity when behind closed doors they don't have any processes which help Black students and even wider students of color. They don't help them when address issues of racism they face from the student body or from their lecturers and academics. There's no support. There isn't cultural counseling that's culturally sensitive. There's none of that. So there really needs to be a big push, not just outwardly but inwardly as well. And even going further, people need to change their mindsets. The vice chancellors of these institutions, academics, lecturers, they need to be willing to educate themselves and understand that there's a real problem. But until that happens, we're just going to keep having this cycle. We can remove the statues. The statues, I welcome that. I welcome the removal of statues of slave traders and colonialists who, have killed millions, who have starved millions. I think, these racist and white supremacist statues need to come down. However, if we completely focus on the aesthetics of what's going on and we just focus on the statues coming down and we don't have that behind the scenes action, that sort of transformative action behind the scenes within the institutions, then the racism isn't really going to go away. And it's actually probably going to become inflamed because you're taking down the statues, but you're not treating the mindset. If that makes sense. So I'll leave it there, inshallah.
Thank you so much for that, Ayo. I think that's a really, really good place to move on. I think the way you framed it, and of course, I think many on this call, and I hope the audience is listening to the concept of decolonizing education, right? Our aim is to decolonize and actually change education systems to ensure that they're inclusive and are able to to really provide holistic pictures of history instead of selective, which I think many of them do. It'd be interesting. I'd love to continue on this concept of decolonizing. Celine, it'd be very interesting to get your perspective, of course, as someone who is who is creating and putting forward your own narratives via your TV, your web TV show, and actually someone who works in institutions. What can be done, and what are your thoughts about concepts around decolonizing the media and decolonizing EU institutions?
Wow. Okay. So for the media, so it's been now about a year since I present Ma Vie Citoyenne Europe. So it's a web TV which I'm presenting, and the good thing is my web TV, only people of color can come in as guests, as experts. I only politicians, the only politician that can come in, like in member of the European Parliament, they are only people of color of the European Parliament. The only white people that would be able to come in without its commissioners, because unfortunately we don't have any people of color commissioner. We only have white commissioners. So if a commissioner were to accept one of our interviews, then that would be okay. But below that, I don't need a white person. I believe that I have within the community, within people of color, I have enough of the expertise to be able to discuss any topic at EU level. So for me, it's the first thing is to put us out there, put us into the discussion, show that, show our expertise and put people of color, like the added value that they have, like put them on the screen. So that's kind of what we are doing with Ma Vie Citoyenne Europe. It takes a bit more time because we're not a mainstream, we're just a web TV. But we hope that by little, we will gain trust from the community, and then the community will start supporting us by watching us, by engaging with us. And because, as I said, like what interests me a lot, it's EU politics, and I am lucky enough to know how it works and how as an individual, but also as a collective, we can have an impact on that. So when first Ma Vie Citoyenne was developed, it was around the European election. So the first thing was that, okay, we need to convince our community that they are part of all this discussion. They are part of this, the development of the EU, the way the EU and decision making are being done. Like whoever they choose as MEP will reflect that. So, but what do you see right now? Within the 571 MEP, there's only about 30 people of color. That's wrong. But I also see that it's twice as much as before. So that means we are moving forward. But to me, we're not moving forward enough or faster. So as much as we want to, we have to see things as short-term, middle-term, and long-term objectives, right? So in terms of policy making, like how does us as a community can change policy? It's as simple as it is. Like when it comes to EU policy, even before it's the Commission put forward a legislation before the member of the European Parliament or the Council, well, they put it before all of us through consultation. A consultation is as easy as it's so easy to answer. So, and it's consultation on everything. It can be consultation on anything that's to do with environment, transition justice. It can be about digital, e-privacy, like really energy. I mean, anything. Like you don't have to necessarily answer every consultation, but I believe we all care about something. And so, yeah, I think this is how you start. You start by it may, like, those consultation, they are the one, like, based on those consultation, based on the outcome of those consultation, EU policy legislation proposal are being made. So, okay, let's say now, okay, you missed the timeline of consultation, right? Because the problem with EU is that it's not that the information is not available, it's just that nobody know where the information is most of the time. Yeah. But obviously, if you're like member of an organization, or if you watch maybe Citoyenne, then you would know where the information are. So let's say you missed it, right? You missed the consultation element. So, but you still have an opportunity to move things up. So, okay, the Commission has presented his proposal. It usually proposes proposal to member of the European Parliament and to the Council. And Council, who are the Council? Member states. Who are the member of the European Parliament? MEPs that you have directly elected to. So all of you, like, this is one thing that I always recommend to anybody that watch anything, or anybody that's interested in EU but just don't know how to start with. Well, first of all, identify your MEP. This is your first job. Identify that person, whether it's white, not white, person of color, what, identify who represents you. And once you've done that, then talk to him. Talk to him. Look at which committee he's sitting in. You know, each MEP needs to decide on, usually sitting on 2-3 MEPs. Some of them maybe are rapporteur. This is how you do it. Like, identify who he is and which MEP he's sitting in. And if he's not sitting on a committee that you care about, well, you can still ask him, well, who within your group, or who is, who do you know who is, sitting on this issue that I really care about. So this is also how you create allies. This is how you, I think this is how you push for, like, I believe that there's two ways to change things. There's the advocacy, policy making, and there's the community level, and there's people that are marching on the street. So your governments are responsible for every decision that are being made at EU level. So the fact that in EU level, there's been an anti-discrimination legislation that has been stuck for 10 years, that is to do with the fact that member states are blocking it. How do you unblock things? It's just unfortunately, sometimes also organization that works at EU level, they sometimes forget, or they're so busy because there's so many things to do. So, like, sometimes they forget to make links and, like, make sure the information at EU level travel all the way down to community level. Because yes, I'm here, I am pushing at EU level certain things. So I will send emails to the commissioner, I will call some MEPs to talk to them, talk to the assistant, saying, okay, well, you really need to come out into this, like, you guys, you can't do this, or you have to be careful of how you say things, right? But if so yes, you can have an influence at MEPs, but then as a citizen, you can also have an influence with your government. So, and I feel like at organizations that are working at EU level should always really make sure that community level, they are aware of what's happening at EU level. Because then, let's say at EU level, there's a block. I can't move it anymore, because, like, it's not like just one thing. It's like multiple parties, multiple countries, different perspective of, for example, the Socialist Party in Germany is definitely not the same thing as the Socialist Party in, let's say, Czech Republic. They may have the same base, but in some things they are totally different. So let's say you have a block there. Then what happens is that at national level, sometimes if community is really rallied and push it, then you can unblock it on the other side, the council side. So sometimes we always forget that there's two sides in policy making when it comes to EU level. So
that responsibility is to engage both sides. Is probably
yes, you always need to really engage both sides. And so there's never any one way to get to the finish line, I will say. You know,
equalize politics is our
and so for me is like, you also need to pressure your media. I mean, as I always say, when the mainstream media, we are their consumer, right? They get because of the audiences they have, then that's how they earn money, etc., etc. So when they look at us, we are consumers, we are dollar bills. So as a dollar bill, you can request things, you can demand that, you can ask simple question, like if you send every day an emails like, oh, do you not know about this expert, like just like suggesting expert, like there's let's say there's a political panel on TV and there's only white people around, men, then there's no reason why people that are watching cannot send an email, a request, and say, well, why do you only have white people when I'm pretty sure this person also understand and talk about this topic? Why can't he come on your show? So this is like us. We also need, it's simple things. Sometimes we think it's like it takes a lot, but I think it's just little things like that, because I understand like not everybody can be on the street, not everybody can donate, not everybody, like, I mean, this is like, this is as like for your media, like you are a dollar sign, like remember you are a consumer, and as a consumer, because unfortunately we are in a very consumer like society where we always want more. We're all about the likes and the retweet and the reshare and the buzz and all of this, and so we kind of miss the what's important. So as consumer, you can request, you can say, I'm sure like if all people of color just stop watching BBC One, I'm pretty sure it's going to have an effect on them, and they're going to think twice about how they do things. Like,
no.
And it doesn't cost you a thing.
Exactly, it doesn't. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Celine. Abiola, I'd love to bring you in now. Maybe it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what can be done to maybe decolonize health and the health systems, of course, we are reliant upon. And of course, like you mentioned earlier, microaggressions have a huge amount to play on one's mental health, and our care and how we're taken care of within these systems is often not to the same levels of people, of course, who aren't black. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
I actually feel like, so the last while, just looking at it from an Irish context, because that's what I'm familiar with, the last while, just the general conversation and the general push that has happened on social media has had like actually a very interesting shift, or at least started a conversation that was not happening at all in the Psychological Society of Ireland. So obviously, so in the last 3 years, I've been doing my research on like race and like how it impacts therapy. And in Ireland, like before I did the research, I was looking for like maybe someone else who had done research in this area or whatever, and I couldn't find anyone. I was looking for like any published research in this area in Ireland, and I found that there was none. But then obviously, whenever I broadened my search and started looking into like, say in America and Canada, there's much more of a discussion in this area, and there's just much more published research in this area. But saying that, there's still not that much in comparison to like other aspects of like, you know, research and whatever. So obviously, like whenever I first started research, there were people who were like, but like therapy for all people of color, that it should be the same thing. Like, what are you looking for? Like, if it works for white people, why wouldn't it work for Black people? Whatever. Like, I got the weirdest comments whenever I started the research. And so whenever the whole push on social media started and that ball started rolling, I mean, like just in my class, I've had like maybe around 4, so that in total we're 14 in our class, and at least 6 of them I've started considering like, oh, you know, that optional thing on like cultural competence and looking at racism in therapy. Maybe perhaps this is an area I need to do more research on, and maybe this is something I need to incorporate into therapy. So I think two things happened within me. So the first thing that happened within me was, on one hand, I was happy that like initially whenever I was saying this was an area that there definitely was a need and for research and just for us to understand better. And whenever I didn't get any support or anyone to join on, I still went ahead with it. I was really happy with that. But on the second hand, I think it made me reflect in my role that I played as an individual in psychology in Ireland. And to put it quite frankly, it's a very white area. It's a very white middle class area. And I realized that like maybe there were times like when the discussion, I could have pushed a little bit more, or I could have challenged a little bit more. And I think that's where I've kind of shifted my role. And so whenever I think of like health now, especially like just in the last while, I started thinking about like, actually, there are loads of like minorities in health, in the healthcare service and industry and like research. Like there's just so many of us, because maybe it's because of like the general push that family pushes us towards that area, but there is a lot of us in that area. And I think kind of like what Celine was touching on is like the impact of like actually like collectively we hold a lot more power than we realize. So, and I think that's where I'm sitting more in, where I'm like, okay, maybe I am just this one Black person in this classroom, but even if I state the opinion, they don't need to hear, but I'll state it anyways. And I feel like that's where I feel like this last while has given us more of a confidence, or at least people are pretending to listen, if not listening. And I think across board, even when we start looking at it from like a healthcare industry, if, you know, say like there are dentists doing that and there are like, you know, doctors doing that, then that starts to shift a very, because if you look at it, like all the research and everything that we know about health is from a very colonized, from a very racist, like it's embedded in it, in that like everything we know were written by white people and the research is supposed to work for all people. Whereas like it was written by white people, done on white people and published by white people. So then how can we make those huge claims, you know?
No, that's actually such a fascinating point, and I think there is a blind spot. I feel exactly in that. Celine, you have something to come into?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, Abiola, what you're talking about, it's just intersectionality. I mean, this is what's missing, whether it's in medical field, whether it's in education, like we need to have this method being mainstream and embedded into us. And I think once we do that, then we will be able to create specific response to specific questions. Yeah. So I'll.
Oh, thank you. No.
And also, like, we can even start the conversation on it in that, like, why is it, like, say, for example, that, like, it always has to be minorities, like, championing in this, you know, whereas like the reality is there are a lot of people who claim to be professors and professionals in these areas, but like it's not an area of focus for them. So like whenever we get into those spaces, we can really challenge and even just start to like pose those questions.
No, I
And
think
it's really hard. Sorry.
no,
It's,
please,
I
please.
wanted to say, Abiola, I know how it is to be the only Black woman in the room. I've been the only Black woman in the room in Brussels for a long time, and it is hard emotionally to come into a room and having to sometime put the record straight. Every time it takes a toll on you. It takes it's like because you are alone, and then you have to come in and talk about those big issues that you know your community is facing, whether it's discrimination, access to employment, and you have to be there, and you are all alone, having to try to rationalize this and not being all emotional in front of all those people. And sometimes it is really hard. So that's also why it's very important to take care of each other, like, and yourself. Like, and I'm really lucky because in Brussels there's this amazing POC Brussels group, and I'm not like it's they have been amazing. They are always there. We are like supporting each other, whether it's like employment, like sharing like jobs opportunity, or you know, reading, walking. I mean, just kind of like really supporting each other, and I think that's important to always have this support with you, because this is a very very long battle, and it's not gonna end with us. But I'm hoping that everything that's been happening right now, it's lead to big, not just conversation, because we've been having a lot of conversation, but to action, like literal action and real steps. And the other thing that I wanted to add, and that Ayo talked about, it's about history. If you look at the situation in EU and the rise of populism that is happening, this should worry all of minority. All people of color should be worried about it. And so I cannot stress enough the importance of registering and voting. Every time you do not vote, you are little by little saying it's okay to treat me like shit. That's how I feel. So
No, thank you for that. One question I want to come to, I only have a couple left because, of course, we are time limited. This one is mostly for Ayo and Abiola. Racism, of course, within the context, especially Abiola mentioned, the Irish people don't necessarily feel as if they can be racist because they were discriminated against. This is a similar narrative that exists within the Muslim community, especially when it comes to anti-Blackness and the experience of Black Muslims within those communities. Is there anything you can speak towards about what Muslims can do better with regards to their support or their response to anti-Blackness in our own communities? Ayo, I'd start with you.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I think it's a very important question. Perhaps some in the Muslim community would have wondered, why are people asking us to, raise awareness about issues affecting the Black community? And I think, I've said that people are right to ask because, within our faith, a verse I constantly will quote and always want to quote is Surah An-Nisa, verse 135, which essentially says we need to stand for justice, whether it be against ourselves or against our relatives and family. Standing for justice is something very important. It's integral to our faith. So I think people are right to ask, and I think also perhaps members of the Muslim community would have made a separation and said Black issues aren't Muslim issues. And I have two things to say to that. One, there's a sizable amount of Black Muslims within the Ummah. You have majority majority Muslim nations in Black African countries, whether it be in West Africa or East Africa. And, even if there's not a majority, when you look at Central Africa and parts of Southern Africa, Southeast, for example, you will find huge and significant amounts of Muslims within those populations. I think just the second thing is that any issue of injustice, where people are being unfairly and disproportionately treated, is a Muslim issue. And I think it's very important that we engage principally on the basis of our faith, through the lens of our faith. That's very important. I think when perhaps discussing with members of the Muslim community, they may say, I think we've heard this quite a lot, Bilal is black, or they may quote certain hadith. I think the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, his last sermon, when he's speaking about essentially there's no superiority of a non-Arab over an Arab, and vice versa, and a black man over a white man, and vice versa. The only one who's superior is the one who's pious. Paraphrasing, by the way, but that's generally the wording. So I think people quote these things, and I think there's nothing wrong with quoting that, but I think it's the way it's used as a rebuttal, and it's used to push back against black Muslims, perhaps speaking around the issue of anti-blackness in the community. And I think, yes, our faith does have, it does have, whether it be things in our tradition, in terms of people like Bilal, Sumayya, Adam alayhi salam, and Musa alayhi salam are also described as being very dark-skinned. We have these people within our tradition to look to, that being black or being, having such a skin color is not something outside of our faith and our tradition, and our figures, our sacred figures. And also, when we can look at ayat, we can look at hadith, and we see those things there, which should be pushing us to fight against racism, anti-blackness, and injustice. However, we need to bring those things to life, and we need to embody them, in our interactions, in our character, and in our sort of community work. And so I think what the Muslim community can do is really just to actively listen to the black community, to understand what people are going through. It's very important, there are for the Muslims who aren't black, or Asian, Arab, and other sort of groups. It's very important for them to understand that this is not your experience. Yes, you may have experienced oppression in different ways, but it's important to listen actively, to understand what the black community is saying, black Muslims and wider black community, to understand why is this something that has been felt so viscerally within the black community, and felt so in such a widespread way. And I think that's part of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to listen, before replying, and to actually let somebody finish as well before they finish speaking. And I think what we can do is to look within ourselves, and to be very, very honest within ourselves, and to look at it as sort of a process of purification. We need to get better. Sadly, I don't think this is going to be the last time a black man is killed in such a way. Inshallah, that it isn't the case. But I think we look at this is a continuous issue. I would like for Muslims to be on the forefront, to have educated themselves, to actually feel this pain as the black community feels it, to know that it's an injustice. Speaking to our family members is something that I'm a very big advocate of, because we can all say things on social media in our echo chambers. We have to be able to go back to our households and have those conversations. If we're not able to do that, change can, yes, come in big ways, in one big swoop. But it actually, a society is a collective of individuals. Individual change, change in those adjacent to you, and if we can do that, the ripple effect will be very large. Once you've looked at ourselves, and once we're doing things with our family, yes, we can now start. Again, it's not a sort of you can't do one without doing the other. In terms of it's like chronological. It is a thing of it's all simultaneous. You simultaneously look at yourself. You simultaneously speak to family members, you simultaneously do things in society. And again, maybe that doesn't work for you. Maybe you just want to do one of those things. But regardless, there does need to be an action taken, whether it's an inward action or an outward one. And I think lastly, our faith, I have said it's quite a shame, because I feel like this is a time where the black community has been in a lot of pain and anguish. And, within our faith, within Islam, we have the solutions to these, spiritual, mental, and physical sort of ailments that people are going through because of this very real anti-blackness and oppression. And I think, if we want to showcase the fact that, yes, we have this solution within our faith, we need to do more to put our faith into practice to wider society, inshallah. So that's it for me, though.
Well, thank you. Abiola?
I think, I kind of I touched on all the points that I had in my head, but I just finished off with 2 points, and that like I had said earlier on about like, you know, the hierarchy of race, and one of the things that is really important for many of us to understand is like we're socialized in a society where, you know, the hierarchy of race is real. So like it's not something like we can't move from one point. We can't say that we experienced racism and not realize that there's a potential for us to also have internalized those racism. So in saying that, like within our Muslim communities, like if we move from a position of like there is a potential that we've internalized the racism, then it's more of an anti-racist stance. And so it's not like I'm looking for you to not be racist. I'm looking for you to actively be working against racism. And that's the difference, you know, where it translates into our community and like even organizations, say like organizations like FEMYSO in itself, where they can start asking themselves like, okay, actually how many member organizations do we have that are from like, you know, specifically Black communities, and how have we included their voices in our platforms? And that's the way it trickles down, because I think on one hand, we can immediately go into like the difficult conversations that you need to have in families and stuff. But a lot of our parents and like they've been socialized in that way. So those conversations might be really tricky. But a really practical thing that you can do is like many of us are involved in many organizations and like we're pushing the Muslim agenda and pushing like Muslim issues. But one of the major Muslim issues that we do all experience is anti-Black. So like how are we collectively, as our organization, individual organization, working against this specifically?
Oh, great. No, thank you so much, Abiola, and I, of course, those are incredible answers to that question. Celine, maybe just to bring you in here a little bit, because I feel it's something that happens in the Muslim community, but also external to the Muslim community, even within liberal and actually communities where you'd assume there would be some allyship. The answer to Black Lives Matter is immediately all lives matter, right? Like, do you want to? Can you speak towards that and why that's so offensive to Black people?
Oh man, Yusuf, like you are. I get so angry when people say that. I'm just like, oh my God, we're not taking away your life. We're not saying your life doesn't matter. We're just saying Black life also matter, because of all the things that are happening. It looks like Black life don't matter. Like that we're just like we are less than anything, that we don't like our life is just another, you know, you go drinking water. It's as simple as that. Like it's nothing to people. It doesn't have value. And this is what we're saying, Black Lives Matters, to make people understand that our life have values. You know, the other thing that I also do not like is people saying there's no color. I don't see color. I'm like, why? Why don't you see color? I see it. Like the problem is not the fact that you see color. The problem is the fact that you are behaving in a certain way because you see my color, my skin color. And that is the issue. And people don't understand. I don't want people to tell me I don't see color. I'm fine. I am Black and I love it. Like there's no problem. I feel like I am very pretty. I don't have any problem with it. So why can't you see me? It's so strange. And in regards to like, you know, I think there's a lot that in terms of allied, and I think people of color in general, the POC as we call it, we should ally more. So for example, there is this EU resolution that was voted about in 2019, March 2019, which is about a resolution on the right of people of African descent. So this is something tangible that, for example, an organization like FEMYSO can support and push for together to make sure that there's something happening at EU level. This is an example.
No, that's perfect. I should mention that we did support that resolution, and we continue to support that resolution being institutionalized by the European Commission, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah. So that is one thing. And there's also about, as I said, like myself, I keep learning new things. I keep educating myself, you know? Like I was pretty much raised in France, and then I was lucky enough to be living in the US. So I'm still learning a lot of things in terms of like, even in terms of racism, in terms of intersectionality, in like all of those like institutionalized racism. I'm still learning, and I think we all need to keep learning, so then we have the tools to be able to shut down bullies, basically, you know? Because like I spent yesterday talking to a friend on Facebook because she posted something so awful. The poster was saying the police officer wouldn't have to arrest you if you didn't do something wrong, something like that. I got so upset with her. I told her, I was like, I am so disappointed in you. And then for like 2 hours, I had to explain to her why I was disappointed in her. And I was like, this is not my job to explain to you those type of things, because it's a lot of work and it's really frustrating. But I still did it. And in the end, still didn't get it. So I'm like, you can't be my friend anymore. Because if you don't, like, especially because I'm like, she's talking to me and I was telling her, well, guess what? Me, I've never been arrested in my life. I've never been stopped and frisked in my life. I'm not scared of the police. My host dad in the US, he's a sheriff. I have a good relationship generally with the police, but I still stand and say out loud that yes, there is institutional racism within police. Because just because I haven't lived it doesn't mean that the people out there are lying. And the problem is that instead of her focusing on the fact that there's 1,000 of people worldwide walking on the street saying there is institutional racism, she's focusing on the fact that 10 people broke something. And I'm like, why are you focusing on that? Why is it that you take out of? Because the media has focused their rhetoric on this. So yeah, I think I think we need to learn ourselves so then we can be stronger and we can have a better argument. We need to support research like Abiola, who is doing a great work in terms of like mental health for people of color and minority. We need to be able to support her to be doing those research. So then she have the information, like whether it's like, oh, she needs like to do interviews with people. You need to be able to be like, I need interviews with people, and then in 2 seconds you've got like 1,000 people sending you application to do interview. This is what I'm saying. We need to support the community to rise up in research and science, so then we have the tools, so then when we put it on the table, it can't be denied. Because right now in France and Belgium and a lot of EU country, there's no statistic available. So you don't really know, you can't really tell. Well, you can tell, but you can't really tell. So there's a lot of, for example, when you look at youth and employment, we all know that within the I think it's 11% of youth, or 16% of youth in employment in EU. Well, at least 10% of that are, well, people of color. So, and you have the EU at the same time and member states that want to eradicate or diminish youth and employment. But then they're not using the right tools, because the majority of youth and employment are people of color. So it's like you want to do something, but then you're not doing it.
Because you're blind to race.
Exactly. It's it's the same. Like, I mean, I have a lot of friends. We all went to, you know, and then people's like, yeah, but just because they didn't went to university, you know, I'm like, okay, I'll give you that. They didn't go to the university. I'm like, do you know how many people I know that have diploma, PhD, and so on, but they still had a hard time finding jobs? Like, I have friends who it took them a year longer to find a job than another white person with the same level of degrees, with the same like scores. So what does that mean?
No, exactly.
Like, it's, yeah. So and we have to understand, like, just because like we are educated doesn't mean racism won't touch us.
Exactly.
No, thank you.
And like, even just to add on that point, you know, in terms of like education, like we in Ireland experience the same level of discrimination, you know, whereas like, you know, you could have all the same experiences or you could have the same qualification, but whenever it comes to specifically applying for the position, then you suddenly don't qualify. But like on top of that, like, you know, there is like a constant level of discrimination that happen with people from minority backgrounds where their degrees are not even recognized. So more and more people are coming to Ireland and their degrees from whatever country they're coming from are not being recognized. And I'm talking about, you know, people with like master's degrees and like, you know, PhD holders, and they're, you know, they're being socialized in a society where all of a sudden whatever qualifications they had before is not just being recognized because of whatever reason, you know. So there's that also playing a big role in, you know, education and like their lives as well.
Yeah, no, thank you to all of you. I'll have to come to an end relatively shortly, but I think to end it will be very useful to maybe hear from each of you, to maybe wrap up, but also it'd be useful to hear tangible examples or activities that Muslims listening to this, and to, of course, whoever audiences can do to support Black communities in their own localities and globally. I'll start with Abiola, then I will go to Celine, and we'll end with Ayo, if that's okay, inshallah.
Okay, so I'll keep it short and simple.
Yeah.
I think two things. The first thing is that, like, as you know, Muslims and ethnic minorities, we are all holding different roles in different aspects of our society. So like that's from like, you know, say working in a supermarket all the way to, you know, being a doctor or whatever. We all hold a different role, and within each aspect we can challenge and push forward from that role specifically. And I think that's it's not easy because, you know, it's coming from our lived experience or a lived pain and a lived struggle. And like what Celine said, you know, you have to look after yourself within that, but holding that voice for the generation behind you. So that's one thing. And then within the Muslim community specifically, it's like the point that I highlighted earlier on, that like a lot of us are involved in like organizations, or like even in our mosque, where you can start like just even asking specific questions that like, you know, what about this group of people and what about this group of people's struggle? And, you know, especially when we're talking about Muslim community, the other thing that comes up is like a lot of times, you know, you meet people who will be like, no, she's a good sister, but I can't marry her, or she's not good enough because she's not Arab. I've heard that specifically. And it's like about you challenging those narratives within your social circle as well. So
Great, thank you. Celine.
All right. Okay. So I have a little list. So first you have what you can do, easy, and it's free because I'm a free person. Like, I like to do, I know like not a lot of people have like the means, like, so I understand this, and I was a student not long ago. So first you can like try to donate to Black Lives Matter through the YouTube. They have a YouTube streaming playlist right now. And so all you have to do is just put on YouTube and just let a stream away, and then the advertisement will, that's how they will get the money. So you don't even have to donate. Just by doing that, you're already supporting the cause. In terms, as I said, educate yourself, learn more about how to become a good ally. So I have a good friend, her name is Vanessa Vavor. She is working working on putting together a platform where it's gonna be like a little like educational things, elements, so then you can understand different terms. For example, what does that mean? Institutional racism, and what does that mean? White fragility and racism, and what's the difference between racism and discrimination? You know, things like that. So she's gonna be working on that. And there is also, where is that? Oh yeah, and there is something that you all need to do is watch I Am Not Your Negro, and I think it would really help, because it provides some history about the US history, but also you can see a bit some flashes of French history and other countries' history in terms of like racism, colonialism, and how it's like unfold basically in the present. One of the examples that I really liked was that by looking at it, you can understand why there's Black colleges. So as I was saying, my friends yesterday on Facebook, she was saying like, but why are there's like only Black colleges? And I was like, good question. So I looked, and then that movie provided me the answer, and the answer is simple. It's just in the beginning they were like, Black people couldn't go to white colleges, so they created their own colleges, and then and then they kind of like became proud of it, you know. So yeah, so it's interesting to, it's important. I think that's what, like, the more you learn about the history, the better you can understand why certain things are the way they are. So yeah, and then the other thing is like, please watch my vie Citoyenne Europe, and whenever you need to vote, go vote. Talk to your MEP, and respond to EU consultation. Here we go.
Thank you so much, Celine. And last but not least, of course, Ayo.
So I'm an avid reader, so I'm just gonna do some book recommendations, some actions. I think, knowledge is power. We hear that a lot. I think it's very important. I think some books I would recommend there's one called Learning to Divide the World by John Walensky. It gives you an understanding behind this whole thing of race science, this fake science that was created, the ranking system, how these systems were used. It also talks about the geography of race, history of race, all these sorts of things. And also touches on British colonialism. There's also Centering the Black Narrative by Dawood Walid and Ahmed Mubarak. Is a really good book. Speaks about Black figures in Islam within our tradition. There's Sacred Activism, just for Muslims who want to look at making their activism more God-centered and also more sustainable. I think this work we're sort of involved in can be very tiring, as was mentioned by both of the other speakers. It can be very tiring. It can be emotionally tiring, spiritually tiring, mentally, in all forms. So Sacred Activism by Dawood Walid. And I think the last book I wanted to mention was, of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think it's very good, just in terms of, I think it really, delves deeply into his psyche, and how he experienced, and he was a victim of in many ways, as was his family and those around him. Black America in general was a victim of the racism they suffered through. So I think those are 4 really good books you can read that will help sort of push you through that transformative journey of understanding these issues. I think there's a petition going around about basically making sure that British curriculums in schools actually include the British Empire and its crimes and what it did. Colonial history is included in the syllabuses. So if you see that, please sign it. I'm going to be sharing on my social media platforms. It's very important we sign it. There are some charities you can donate to. So there's the United Friends and Families campaign, which is a campaign based here in the UK, raises money for the families and friends of victims of police brutality and killing at police hands in the UK. And I think just please, keep sharing awareness, keep you know, it's very important. People have different ways of doing their community work and activism. I think it's just important, the way you do it, just make sure you keep your foot on the pedal, just keep going, keep being consistent in what you're doing. I think, you know, last but not least, very important to keep making dua, keep praying for the Black community, just so that they're able to be alleviated of this oppression. So I think that's all from me, inshallah.
Well, thank you so much, Ayo, and thank you, Celine, Abiola, for your contributions. This has been our longest live stream, and I think there's a reason behind that. It's because it was a topic that needed discussion and needed input, and I think our audience will be very appreciative of all of your thoughts and your ideas moving forward. I'd like to mention from the FEMYSO perspective, anti-racism work is something that we're trying to put at the core of our agenda. And over the last couple of weeks, we have set up a race equality working group and are looking towards how we can substantially support our member organizations and other Muslim youth organizations in being able to really understand what race looks like and what inclusion looks like, which I feel within the faith sector always has its difficulty. And we're trying our utmost best to be leading figures in this. That aim is to center the voices of Black Muslims and to center the voices of those fighting this struggle. We are incredibly appreciative of all the thoughts that you have given tonight and to our audience for listening. And I would like to end by saying FEMYSO will continue to be a voice for the voiceless, one that tries its utmost best to make Europe a more diverse, cohesive, and vibrant place, fighting for the human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity for all of its citizens. And I end with the three words that we started this discussion with, and that is Black Lives Matter. Thank you.